Start recording. Starting now. Welcome back to our intuitive introduction to machine learning and AI. This course, as I mentioned before, it is an invitation to learn about this fascinating subject. We started yesterday to recap what we did. We asked ourselves this question: what is machine learning? What is artificial intelligence, or what is intelligence itself? We looked into the word artificial, which was easy to unpack. It comes from artifice, that which is made with human effort and not found growing on trees, for example. And intelligence is a much more nebulous concept. Nobody has really quite defined it satisfactorily, but we all seem to have, rightly or wrongly, a belief that there is such a thing as intelligence. Today, we define in a more scientific way intelligence as reflected in the ability to learn. We say that a machine exhibits intelligence in its ability to learn, and learning can be measured, and therefore it is amiable to the tools and the concepts and the machinery of science and engineering. Now, you measure learning, amongst other things, by, for example, in the case of regression, by measuring the error, how much mistakes are being made in classification and regression, the degree or magnitude of mistakes, or number of mistakes. They give you an intuitive sense of the errors, and when you see a machine is making less and less mistakes, as it observes the data, you say that the machine is learning. It's beginning to get better at the task. So that is learning, and that is true for human beings too. Learning is something that many life forms exhibit, human beings in particular. And you see that in children. You see that if you have a dog, as I suppose most Californians here do, a cat, you do see you see your pets also learn. Now, the fact that we can create learning machines out of what is essentially sand, which you transform into silicon, into semiconductor wafers, and do a pretty intricate sort of designs, integrated circuit layout designs on top of it. And then you bring in the whole architecture of neural networks, for example, or support vector machines, or name the algorithm of your choice in machine learning. And the fact that this dead matter can be made to learn from data is perhaps one of the most astonishing facts in our everyday life. If you reflect upon it, it looks unbelievable that one could do that. One could take a bucket of sand and through a whole set of transformations and processes and artifice, we could actually make something out of that sand which could learn from data. That is machine learning, and therefore machines exhibit artificial intelligence. We talked about correlation. Two things are correlated if the variation in one causes a corresponding variation in the other, either in the same direction or the opposite direction. We talked about the fact that correlation should not be conflated with causation. It's something that we are all taught, I suppose, in school years. Nevertheless, it remains one of the common fallacies of the human mind. I catch myself in that fallacy more often than I would like to admit. Likewise, there's another fallacy, sequentiality and causation. Just because something happened after something else doesn't mean that something else was the cause of something. For example, to make the matter ridiculous, I mentioned that I came to Silicon Valley in the late 90s. Thereafter, there was a massive boom of innovation, the dot-com boom, ideas, creativity, and the whole economic engine of Silicon Valley was in high gear. So if sequentiality could be considered causation, then one could conclude that the whole boom must have been caused because I came to the Silicon Valley, which is patently absurd. Right? But we make such mistakes. We took the example of the flight instructors. We took the example of the coaches at Berkeley. It is a fallacy we fall in for more often than not. As we said, every leader, when he becomes or she becomes a leader, takes credit for every success that happens thereafter, saying they became the leader, and because of their becoming the leader, things are successful. Look at the presidents of the US. If there are failures, then of course it's because of the work of the predecessor. Right? We do it in our own leadership, in our little ponds, in the teams that we lead. And so throughout all of this is the fallacy which we more often than not fall for, which is sequentiality appears to be the causation. Then we talked about the concept of regression. If you remember, we talked, what is regression? Regression is the search, given a variable x and a variable y, it is the search for, in two dimensions, it's search for a function, a curve that relates y to x. When we do that, you have a function, but there remains a part that is unexplained, which has a fancy name, that is irreducible error. And that error comes because there are other factors. For example, if you take the age of a child and from that predict the height, and you use only this variable, there are many other factors that you didn't consider: the gender, the ethnicity, the economic, nutritional background, and so on and so forth. And those manifest themselves in the irreducible error of your model. So irreducible error of the model, in many ways, is trying to tell you that there are more things affecting Y than you have accounted for. Namely, there are more things than X affecting Y. And so it's something worth knowing. We capture errors in multiple ways. It's a departure between Y and Y hat, which is also called the residual. This is the residual for the ith term. And so you add up all the residuals by taking the absolute value. You get the mean absolute error, taking the average of those. Or you can take the square. As I mentioned, one of the results early on, way back in 1812, was that under certain well-behaved conditions, the mean squared error is the best linear estimator. The technical term is the best linear unbiased estimator. Now, we won't go into all the nuances of it, but suffices to say that the squared error is far more common. We went a little bit about what it means in reality now, and we went into the phenomenon of regression towards mediocrity or regression towards mean, a thing that Galton wrote a paper about many, many years ago. And if I may, all of these things, by the way, all these references, etc., are now available on the course portal. If you were to go to the course portal, let's visit it briefly. Where is the course portal? Here we go. If you were to come here and visit this upcoming courses, introduction, an intuitive introduction to it, you'll notice that we have a Discord server, there's a Zoom link. Here is, by the way, we created a quiz also that you can use to self-evaluate. The recording of yesterday is here, YouTube recording permanently. So you can refer back to it and listen to it if you so wish. And today's recording and the next two recordings will also be there. So, and then when we talk about regression towards mediocrity, the causation, and we have this link of spurious correlations and so forth, some hilarious correlations that were observed, conflicting sequentiality with this, then finally regression, what it is, and a quick summary, and then finally Galton's famous paper, which was on regression towards mediocrity. Right? And this paper should show up at some point. But I won't go into that. It is there. You folks can read. Those of you who are motivated by the history of things can go and read. So that was it. So today's main topic is classification. I haven't put resources here. I'll do it after the section. But before I go into classification, I would like to start with one danger that you have whenever you try to hypothesize with data. So I will use regression itself to bring about the, the dangers of making machine learning models. It's one of the most common dangers. It is as common today with this ginormous large language models as it was with, for example, the simplest models. Though the situation with LLMs, it's a little bit more complex because we see some very unexpected behavior. But for simplicity's sake, I will assume that it's much more, in some form or the other, it's universally applicable. See, suppose I have points like this. Now, you could build a hypothesis that the relationship is this, a straight line relationship. You could, on the other hand, hypothesize that the real relationship is, let's say, this. Let me call this A. Let me call this B. And let me make yet another hypothesis in, let's say, blue color, which goes like this. If you notice, the blue line, which is C, happens to have no errors at all. You realize that it is going through all the data points, isn't it? So if you're just looking at the total error, you might be tempted to say, oh, I like model C. And yet, intuitively, you may say that no, it doesn't look right. It looks way too complicated. Model green model, A model, looks way too simplistic. The relationship is not linear. Model B seems to be the good, it seems to be the Goldilocks region between too simple a model and too complex a model, too flexible a curve. And so you say that A suffers for being too simplistic. It exhibits something that the statisticians call a bias error. We will leave those terms aside. C exhibits a kind of error called variance error, but I would like to explain it in simple terms. You say that A underfits the data. You can see that. It hardly fits to the data. On the other hand, C overfits the data, isn't it? The problem with C is if you bring more data, it begins to look wrong because any data you train your model on is only a partial subset of the data. So if you start picking data points, more data points, you start noticing that B looks much better than C, isn't it? So C actually thinks that the training data with which it was trained on, it is the only reality and its job is just to fit that. Another way that people say it is that C has in some sense just memorized the data and figured out a way to produce good answers only for those data points. But it will not generalize further. Therefore, it has not learned much. So there is a trade-off. What can you do to remove this overfitting? The process of removing overfitting is called regularization. So in this field, it has its own sort of a jargon, but it sounds like such a big mouthful of a word, regularization. But all it means is, how do you convince the machine not to draw C, but to draw B as a function? And as you can clearly see from this picture, you can say, well, one simple way would have been just to have given the machine much more data to learn from. Because if it had much more data, it would not have made such gross mistakes like this big error. Right? And so more data is one way to regularization. This has very real life implications. These days, we train these so-called large language models. And one of the things you do, we realize that these are ginormously complicated models. In the beginning, when you give it some data, it just quietly memorizes it. And it will just give you good answers only for the data it has seen. But as you give it more and more and more data, it begins to learn to generalize correctly. Right? So more data truly is a generalizer, is a regularizer. It enforces or coaxes, it's a forcing function for generalization.
Asif, what is that arrow to the amplitude arrow that you drew from the purple to the blue?
It's a mistake. So this is the prediction. Remember, this is the y hat
prediction. Y hat. Yes.
The reality, right? This is the reality, right? So the errors become huge.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were to give more data, the machine would not draw C, it would instead draw B. Isn't it?
Yep. Yep.
More data is one of the most effective regularizers that you can have. There are other regularizers that you do, but they are a more advanced topic. Those of you who are coming to my introduction to AI course starting next week, you will get a much more rigorous mathematics and lots of labs where you will have real life situations where the machine overfits the data, and then you need to regularize it with more data. We'll have lots of animations and things like that, but that is something to remember. So with regularization as a topic out of the way, regularization, by the way, you need to do for classification and regression. It is true. It's a consideration that is pretty pervasive all across machine learning. Now, with that topic out of our way, I would now go to classification. And once again, while those of you who already know this topic or are mathematically inclined would realize that I'm eschewing math as much as possible, or eschewing jargon as much as possible. And the goal is to keep it very intuitive and more accessible. So imagine that there is a box, and this box gives you an answer which is a picks from one of a finite number of choices. So for example, you can give it, let's take something very simple. You can give it the age, or not the age, let's say that the outside sunlight, how much sunlight is coming through the window. So your window, let's say that is your X. All it has to do is tell you what time of day is it. Is it morning? Is it daytime, like noon? Or broad daylight? Let me just say broad daylight. Let me call it early morning, broad daylight, late evening, or night. Suppose it had to do that. You would say that's a pretty intuitive thing. It should be able to do that simply by drawing a number line from 0, how much light is coming in, and you would agree that all you're doing is finding, in a sense, certain cutoff points. You say, all right, up to this level of brightness coming through the window, I will call early morning. This much is, if it is early morning or late evening, it is, let's say, and maybe these two will have to club together in this example. So it is early morning / late evening. This is, I suppose, oh no, we have to start with night first. Up to a certain level, when there's very little light, you can say 0 to this, we will still call it night. Then this is early morning, and after that, anything after or late evening, and anything after that is daylight. Does that make sense? This is common intuition. Or another example could be, I ask you, you're looking at an animal, is it a cow or a duck? And I give you, let's say, I give you the weight of the cow, weight of the animal. How would you tell it apart? It's quite simple. You can lay the weight on the, let's say that this is your x-axis, the weight is your input. You know that all the feathery little ducks would have a weight around, let's say, 10 pounds, give or take, somewhere around 10 pounds. And all the cows would have a weight around, let's say, give or take, I don't know, does somebody know the weight of cows? I'll just hazard a guess, 400 pounds.
400 pounds, yeah.
About 400 pounds, right? And so if a machine has to be able to tell the difference between the weight, learn from the data. Suppose I give it data. I say a table of data to learn from the reality, X and Y. X is weight, and this is label. This is what it is. As an example, 9 pounds, it is a duck. For 16 pounds, cow. 11 pounds, duck. And so on and so forth. And I asked the machine to learn from this data. Intuitively, think about it. How would you learn it? What you would do is you would say, you know what? I am going to draw I will take a point along the x-axis as my cutoff. Isn't it? Everything that is on this side of it, I will call a duck. Everything on this side, I will call a cow. And if you set a rule like this, that would seem sensible, isn't it? At the end of the day, a machine basically needs to learn that ducks are light, feathery stuff, are light in weight, and cows are relatively much heavier in weight. Right? And it is very unlikely that you'll encounter a duck so hefty that you would mistake it for a cow, or a cow so light that you would mistake it for a duck, isn't it? So you would do this. You would draw this. This point is the crucial point. So in a way, to classify, this process is called classification. Given x, the f of x belongs to the set of just two variables, cow or duck, isn't it? You need a function that maps every input and says, aha, if the animal has a weight 9 pounds, it must be a duck. If it is 416 pounds, it must be a cow. So to be able to create such a model is to, and this model is called a classifier. It's very intuitive, I suppose, the term classifier. And this is to classify into cows and ducks. But this point is crucial. It has a name. You realize for a machine to learn how to classify is the same as for the machine to have found a good cutoff point like this on the number line. Am I making sense, guys? Now, let's take a slightly different example. Suppose you take, and obviously I will exaggerate or oversimplify things. Suppose you take grapes, and what should we take? The grapes and strawberries. So grapes are, let's say, California grapes. They are all, and let's say the axes are weight and size. So as you know, grapes tend to be, grape points would be somewhere here. Grapes are small relative to strawberries or gooseberries or some heftier, bigger berries. This is how the grapes would look. Right? Mostly they would occupy a region like this. Right? Roughly speaking, there'll be some big grapes and small. Well, this is not quite biologically correct. You cannot have big sized grapes that will be very light, but I am exaggerating and oversimplifying the situation. So take it not too literally. And let's say that you have, what other fruit did we take? Let's take strawberry. Here we have strawberries. Let's say that the world was really so cut and dry, the data was well separated. This is all your big, heavy things are strawberries. Then obviously there would be occasionally small strawberries and a few big grapes. So there would be a little bit of an overlap, let's say. Now, suppose I tell you, I'm going to give you a vector in which I give you the weight and the size of any fruit. Given a fruit, I give you just the weight and the size, two things. Right? It would represent a point somewhere. Suppose that point happens to be A. What is your basic intuition? If I give you a fruit whose weight and size falls at A on the graph, would you call it a grape or would you call it a strawberry? You would call it a strawberry, isn't it? Why? Because it's surrounded by strawberries. They're big and heavy. Likewise, if I gave you something that was like here, B, you would call it a grape. But intuitively, you can see that passing through all of this is a sort of a boundary. Let me mark that boundary here. A line, you can imagine. And you can say that everything on this side of the line is a grape. Everything on this side of the line is a strawberry. If you could find such a line to separate it out, it doesn't mean that it's perfect. As you can see, there are some grapes on one side. You will still make mistakes. A few of the strawberries will be recognized as grapes, and a few of the grapes would get recognized as a strawberry. Nevertheless, it is the best boundary that you can make, a straight line boundary that you can make between the two fruits. Does that make sense, guys? Such a boundary has a name in machine learning. It is called a decision boundary. A decision boundary. Now, you can generalize it to higher dimensions, but you'll stop at 2. And if you think about it, this point was actually a one-dimensional decision boundary between ducks and cows, because you have one-dimensional data. That decision boundary is just a point in the number line that divides it into 2 regions, one for ducks, one for cows. And this decision boundary here in fruits divides the feature space into 2 regions. One region belongs to grapes, and other region is the kingdom of strawberries. To find such a decision boundary is the goal of a classifier, right? So you say that when you ask a machine to learn from data, and I'll write it down, when you ask it succeeds for classification. And the context here is classification. It succeeds when it has discovered the best decision boundary separating the 2 classes. In this particular case, I take 2, so I'll just, because it's a simple example, 2 classes. Let's say grapes versus strawberries. Does that make sense, guys? And so classification, one of the great workhorses of our industry of machine learning, is simply finding through all sorts of clever mathematical means this decision boundary. Now, you may you may say, well, I color myself unimpressed. Why can't we do this simply by programming? Right? So it turns out that you can't really do it well. Actually, you can sort of do it. What you can do is you can draw lots and lots of lines, and then amongst the lines, see which one gives you the best classification. That's a trial and error method. The problem with that is two things. One is on this page, you can draw infinitely many lines. You can draw a line here, here, there, here, everywhere. On a page, there are infinitely many lines. Right? And so you'll have to do a test on all of them. You can't, realistically speaking. The other problem is, even if you find, suppose you do a trial of 1,000 lines and you pick the best amongst them, there is no guarantee that it just happens to be the best amongst thousands. It is not necessarily the best decision boundary. The next problem, of course, is here I've made the decision boundary as a straight line. Quite often, decision boundaries are not straight lines, but they are actually complicated curves. They can be like this. And if they are curves, well, now all is lost, because programmatically, how do you know the shape of a curve? There's literally an infinity of shapes of the curves that you can draw in two dimensions. Right? So for all of those reasons, you cannot actually discover this by programming or by trial and error. Right? There's sort of a joke I would like to mention. When people join computer science departments, one of the first courses they take teaches them sorting. So they are taught something called bubble sort, which is relatively inefficient. It's quadratic, expensive. Like, in other words, it gets expensive pretty fast as the data sizes grow. Then they're taught other methods which are more sophisticated, like quick sort and merge sort and so forth, which do things more efficiently. But then the question comes, what is an algorithm that may not be efficient, but nevertheless is the simplest one, doesn't require any clever thinking, and is still a legitimate sorting algorithm? So there is one actually, it's called BOGO sort. All you do is you take the numbers, for example, if you're sorting numbers, you take the numbers, just shuffle them up, see if the shuffle is sorted. If it is sorted, you say yay. If it is not sorted, you say, oh shucks, and go shuffle them again. And you keep shuffling, and one day you'll end up with a shuffle in which all the elements are ordered and it is sorted. So it's somewhat like that. Now you would agree that that would be, while that's a valid sorting algorithm, nobody in his right mind should ever practice that. Right? It will be prohibitively expensive, especially as the data set sizes grow and the number of permutations grow. The same is true in machine learning. You cannot just say, I'll keep on drawing decision boundaries till I hit upon one that is good. Here the situation is much worse. Good compared to what? There might be even better one. So therefore, this process of finding the decision boundary is very much a mathematical machine learning task. And there is a lot of theory associated with it. There are many, many algorithms, literally, I would say thousands of classifiers, if you were to think about it. There are broad categories of classifiers, from logistic regression to simple ones like logistic regression, linear discriminant analysis, and so forth, to decision trees, random forest, gradient boosting, support vector machines, neural networks, and so forth. And each of these has further subdivisions. There are further variations amongst these. Lots of variants and lots of possibilities. So very much like the world of regression, in the world of classification, people have been extraordinarily creative. And over the decades, they have created a vast arsenal of classifiers. All these classifiers, they work well in certain domains and don't work so well in other domains. For example, if you are doing, let's say, You're looking at a picture, and the picture should tell whether it's a cow or a duck. It turns out that neural networks are a special kind of neural networks, convolutional neural networks, or transformers, are extraordinarily effective in being able to do that. But if you used either, let's say, a linear regression, it would succeed, but not as well. It wouldn't do so well. So different contexts require different classifiers. I mean, logistic regression, actually, not linear, logistic regression. So every context you will find, every domain, you'll find that some methods do better than others. Some approaches do better than others. And indeed, there is a theorem, one of the most profound results in machine learning is, and I just started by saying it's one of the most profound results, but it goes by a somewhat frivolous name called the no free lunch theorem. The no free lunch theorem is perhaps one of the greatest contribution to the philosophy of knowledge, theory of knowledge, that this field of AI has ever made. And what it says is that no one algorithm or approach will always be better than another algorithm. For every different data type, data context, different algorithms will shine. It's a pretty profound result. People get carried away by the latest and the greatest, and then they go into an angst when the latest and greatest doesn't work for their particular case. Now, if they were cognizant of this theorem, and theorems are theorems, then there's never veto of it. Once a theorem is proven, it's true for all eternity. It's not to be debated. So the theorem says data decides which algorithm will do that. So no more than a few algorithms and try them all out and see what works best for your particular situation. So that is about classification and regression. Classification and regression come under a form of learning that is called supervised learning. Supervised learning is that when you give it training data, when you give it X input and Y, you say that for example, for this weight 11, it's a duck. For 416, it's a cow. Right? You're giving the X and the Y. Right? Or in the regression problem, you're giving, I forgot what regression problem I took. Yeah, predicting the age or the height. Height was Y, age was X. So given X, you were given pairs of X and Y of kids, and the machine learned from that. When the machine learns from training data, and Y is often called the label in this language, label. Training labeled, you say labeled training data, then this form of learning has a name to it. It is called supervised learning. So now, one of the questions we will go to now is, how do you know that a machine has learned well? How do you quantify the errors of classification? Remember, you say that a machine has learned only if you can see a progressive reduction in errors, isn't it? It should do better, certainly, than random guess. Otherwise, it has not learned anything at all, or it has, in fact, mislearned or misunderstood if it is doing even worse than random chance, which also does happen, actually. But sometimes you'll be embarrassed to learn that you trained an algorithm on data, and it basically is doing worse than random chance. Not as rare as one would imagine. So we'll come to those metrics, but let's take a few examples of classification. One example of classification is for example, common examples that are quoted. You're looking at a flower, and you have to tell either from the image or the properties of the flower, the size of the petal and the sepal and the width of the petal and sepal. You're supposed to tell which species of flower it is. That's a classification problem. You're looking at the picture of a tree, and you have to tell which tree is it? Is it a coconut tree or an oak tree? Is it a weeping willow? Right? Or is it a pepper tree? And coconuts and oaks are easy to distinguish, coconut trees and oak trees, but perhaps weeping willow and California pepper tree, they are a little bit slightly harder than the previous example to tell apart. Right? More realistically, in medical use cases, for example, if you have just come up with blood test or some results, or there has been a biopsy, a tissue biopsy, to tell from the biopsy whether or not you have a malignant tumor. Right? To look at an X-ray image of the lung and to tell whether or not there is lung cancer present. Okay? These are all examples of classification. In finance, for example, to look at your behavior of how well you handle loans in the past, to tell what is your risk score. So you're predicting a number, so that's a regression problem. But to decide whether or not to give you a loan, you're a safe bet to give you a loan, a mortgage, for example, that's a classification problem. Right? The machine is trying to determine, is it safe to give you the loan? Are we together? Are you likely to repay the loan? So these are examples of classification. And you can conjure up many more examples. These days, everybody is very excited that soon we might have self-driven cars. I think it's a little harder problem than most people initially thought or anticipated. Nevertheless, the car has to continuously be looking at the road and tell what it is looking at. Is it a road or is it a pedestrian? Is it safe to drive over it, or are you going to hurt somebody? That's a classification problem. In particular, that problem is called image segmentation. Identifying everything that you see in the visual field. Right? These are all classification problems. So now let's think about the measures of classifiers. How would you know that a classifier is good or bad? So let's take our cows and ducks. They make for a good example. Suppose something is a cow and something is a duck. And your machine predicts something, makes a prediction that let's say that there are 100 cows and 100 ducks, just for the sake of argument. This is the real number. Now, let us say that your machine is able to predict 80 of the cows as cows. So this is the prediction, cow hat and duck hat. Like machine says, takes a data instance, and let's throw in a number here. Let's say 65 of the cows get predicted as cows, and conversely, 35 of the cows get misclassified as ducks. Right? Likewise, for 100 ducks, let's say that 80% of the ducks get identified as ducks, but the remaining 20% get misclassified as cows. Right? So when you look at this axis, you would agree that these things represent the correct answers. Right? You can say that this is correct and this is correct, isn't it? So you can say that the number of the errors are, and these are errors. This 35 and this 20 are errors, 55 errors. Would you agree? Total is data points is 200, 35 errors. And so you say error rate is 55 over 200, that is equal to 22.5%, actually 27.5% error rate. Am I getting my things right? 27.5% error rate. And accuracy is the proportion of correct answers. It is usually 1 minus error rate. What proportion you got right, namely 80 plus 65, that is 145 over 200, and that is equal to 72.5%. So this is the accuracy of your model. Are we making sense? But sometimes it matters. There are other measures that you use. So this is a very simple way of computing errors. Actually, for classifiers, there are much more sophisticated methods. For example, there are things like precision, recall, right, which also come in, and F1 score, which is essentially harmonic mean of precision recall. I apologize if I'm throwing mathematical terms here, precision and recall. So ignore the F1 term. Precision and recall. Without going into their specific definitions, I'll give you a gut feeling or an intuition into that. And the way I'll do that is I'll take the question of cancer, breast cancer. Actually, that data set is very often used to teach this concept. See, after a certain age, most of us, based on our gender, fear having either breast cancer or prostate cancer. It's pretty common. For the sake of argument, I'll just take breast cancer because the academic data set is the breast cancer that is often used in books. So typically, people go through a screening for breast cancer. Let us imagine that a machine was doing the screening and artificial intelligence was doing the screening. So, and the machine is imperfect. It does make mistakes. And now let us think through the consequences of making a mistake. See, if you have breast cancer and the machine identifies you to have breast cancer, that is a good thing. It is unfortunate that you have breast cancer, but now you'll be under medical treatment, and hopefully, these days, most people get cured of it, if caught early. On the other hand, if you don't have breast cancer, well, you're in the best of all outcomes. You can go home happily whistling. Now, suppose a machine does make a mistake, and there are two kinds of mistakes you can do. One is called false positive and false negative. Let's write those terms down. False positive, positive being cancer that you have. So false positive means, and we'll deconstruct these words, and false negative. Whenever you see the word false, it means there's an error there. Means false positive means the person does not have cancer, and you declared that he has cancer. She has cancer, breast cancer. Conversely, false negative means that she did have cancer, but you made the mistake of saying she does not have cancer. Do I hear a question? Okay. I hope I'm making myself clear. So I'll repeat that.
Hi.
Go ahead. Akka, do you have a question? I'm not sure I understood the question. All right. A false positive and false negative, therefore. False positive is you don't have cancer, but the machine concludes that you do have. False negative is you do have cancer, but the machine accidentally says, no, you're fine. Now, let's look at for a screening test, which error is worse? Would somebody like to venture a guess? What would be bad for just a first level screening test? Remember, if a machine says that you may have cancer, you are sent for subsequent medical tests. So if it is a false positive, you will come back shocked, unhappy. right? Maybe you will start writing your memoirs and whatnot. But then 1 week later, your other medical test results will come and it will turn out you don't have cancer. So it would be just a very dramatic and very sort of like mental torture of a 1 week. So obviously false positive is bad, but what about false negative? Suppose you do have cancer and the machine says, no, you're fine, go home. And you happily go home. Most likely you'll go for the screening in another 6 months or the next year. What do you think will happen to that? That cancer will progress, it can metastasize, and by the time you come for screening next year, when it may become very obvious that you do have cancer, there would be a much more significant damage. You may, worst case situation, not be possible to bring you back healthy again. It may have become a terminal illness, or it could cost medically tremendous amount of effort to rescue you and a tremendous amount of anguish and suffering for you later on. So which would you say is much worse, false positive or false negative in this situation? Anyone, guys?
False negative.
I would say
Exactly.
false negative. Yeah.
False negative would be disastrous. So the score that there is a score that whose goal is to minimize false negative is called recall. Good recall, a machine with good recall is a machine that will have very low false negatives. It will find out quickly if you have. Now, that was for the screening test. Let us say that you got a false positive and there are more tests done. And there is a surgeon sitting there or standing there outside the operating theater, all ready with his knives and surgical equipment to cut you open and remove the tumor. But before that happens, there has to be one final test. Another machine algorithm has to be absolutely sure that you have cancer, because something terribly invasive is going to be done to rescue you. It is a firefighting effort that will take place. It's a surgical effort to rescue you. Before you go through such an invasive surgery, you want to make sure that you really do have cancer. For that test, what would be a good measure? You know that you have already been through screening. Even if there was a slightest chance, a good screening, which has good recall, would have caught it. At this moment, right before the operation, which could be fatal, which could be very invasive, what is most important is there is no false positive. You don't cut open a person who is perfectly healthy, isn't it? So the final test before surgery has to have a very low false positive rate, right? So it has to be able to say, if it says something is positive, it genuinely should be positive. And the measure that does it is precision. Precision is what you look for. And I've sort of, by the way, if you are into all of this, there are enough reasons to squabble with me, because I have oversimplified the situation quite a bit. But it's for the purpose of conveying the main message that when you look at classifiers, there are many measures: accuracy, error rate, precision, recall, and there are more. Which particular measure you look at when you want to judge whether your machine is good, your algorithm is good, your model is good, it depends on the context, the real world context. It is the context that determines whether your model is good enough or not. Are we together? Okay. For example, if you want to predict whether how much it's going to rain, It doesn't matter whether it will say, for example, 3.2 inches or 3.22 inches of rain today. It is immaterial, that level of error. But to be able to say between 0 degree precipitation and 3.2 inches of precipitation, the difference is, in the former case, you wouldn't carry an umbrella. In the latter case, you would carry an umbrella, isn't it? So usually context determines how important it is to uh, how the goodness of your model. How good does it need to be? Completely depends on the context. In many contexts, a good enough model is enough. But in some other context, the model has to be extraordinarily sensitive and precise, and has to have very good metrics. Right? For example, in particle physics, if you are making a prediction, if you're looking at a lot of subatomic particles being bombarded against each other in a particle accelerator, and in this ginormous high energy interactions, when those things happen, then for tiniest of the instant, exotic new particles get created. Those particles have very tiny lifetimes, but they give us a clue into the ultimate fabric of this universe, the fundamental laws governing space-time and nature, of forces, nuclear forces, and so forth. So these are, they provide validations for various standard models and storm forces, nuclear forces, and so on and so forth. But before you venture and say, aha, I've discovered another particle, as you know, the big news a few years ago was the discovery of the so-called God particle, the Higgs boson. Higgs boson's discovery was very, very important because without the Higgs field, physicists have no way to explain how the universe started out as a ball of light. Light is massless, and all of a sudden, it ended up with the universe that we have today. Well, not all of a sudden, but over time, we end up with the universe of today, where matter tends to be massive. Right? If in doubt, stand upon the scale. Everything has mass. So how did that happen? And it turns out that to give mass to matter, you need a field called the Higgs field. And its manifestation is there must exist a particle at extremely high energies that must have existed, the kind of high energies that were there in the beginning of the universe, called the Higgs bosons. So when you do particle accelerators and you suspect that you have seen the Higgs boson, and people did actually see the Higgs boson, but they were not quite sure. They needed to be absolutely, absolutely sure. It was not okay. In fact, the first papers that indicated that they're in the particle accelerator, they are seeing the Higgs boson, came out years before it was fully confirmed. But those papers are not considered definitive because when the consequences are so dramatic, a fundamental theory of nature is going to be proved or disproved, or is going to be proved or still continue to remain unproven. When something that big is at stake, you need to be absolutely sure that what physicists call resonance that they are seeing, those resonances correspond to a genuine Higgs boson. Right? So the amount of certainty that you expect from your models, from your experiments, depends on the context. If, on the other hand, you're trying to predict you have a new car model and you are trying to predict that in North America, in a certain demographic, let's say professional people who are interested in machine learning, how much will this car sell? From a manufacturing perspective, if you get it right, even up to plus minus, let's say 1,000 cars, you're doing pretty good. If you say, oh, I think this car will sell about 100,000 pieces, right? And it turns out to be 101,000 pieces or 999 or something, no harm done. Even if you're off by 10,000, I suppose, no harm done. So context determines in machine learning algorithms how precise or how good your model has to be to make predictions. And the consequences of those decisions are important. So I will, because obviously this field is vast. Just classifiers have had, I should imagine, hundreds and hundreds of PhDs written on it, for different kinds of classifiers, different measures of classifiers, etc. I won't speak more about it. I would like to pretty much end today with this. I would invite you to do this. First, I would invite you to take the quiz that is there on the course portal. It will give you, on yesterday's topic, it will give you some level of understanding on how well you understood the lecture, the session of yesterday. And I will be posting a quiz on everything that I said today also. And you can test your self-knowledge, how well you grasped. I invite you to come to the portal and do that. But more than that, today's topic, I deliberately kept brief, not because it's a short topic, but because it's a vast topic. And by conscious decision, we are not going into the technical, too much of the technical details on how it is done. That is the scope of a more formal course that will start next week. So questions, guys, any questions? The audience is extraordinarily quiet today.
Asif, at some point, you referred to, I'm just backtracking in my notes, you referred to underfitting or overfitting as something in variance?
Bias and variance.
Bias and variance.
Bias, yes, because they get to be mathematical. I'll sort of hold off on that. By sort of conscious decision, I wanted to keep this course to something that could be understood by, hopefully, high school kids.
Understand. Okay.
So any questions, guys? I can go much deeper. We have time. I could go much deeper, but did this small introduction give you a basic sense of what classifiers are? Classifiers are identifiers. Given input, it will tell, is it a cow or a duck? It will tell, is this person loan worthy or not? Does this person seem to have cancer or not? Things like that, right? Or what is it? Right? You can show it a picture and it can identify which animal is it from the myriad animals that are out there. A car that's driving with computer vision and looking at the road, it needs to quickly segment everything it sees into trees, pedestrians, road, fire hydrant, all of those things. That is classification. Questions, guys?
Sir, one question. While putting the classification, there has to be a ceiling, a boundary. I mean, let's say it's auto driving car is identifying whether it's a pedestrian or a road, or the car has to also mindful of the other cars are coming or the traffic.
Other
So
way.
yeah. So what should be the upper ceiling? I mean, the boundary which we have to put in which way? Can you more elaborate on that?
See, if you, let's say that you have to look at pedestrian, you cannot harm a living thing. It's first do no harm, right? So even if there is a slight chance, reasonable chance that you're looking at a pedestrian, you do want to classify it as a pedestrian, right? So your recall for pedestrian has to be very, very high, right? But at the same time, if you mark everything as pedestrian at the slightest hint, the car may not be able to drive forward at all because it's looking at road and noise on the road, or let's say a stray paper on the road, and thinking because it's moving that it might be a pedestrian. So that's where the magic of machine learning comes in. How do you, even when you're making trade-offs and you're leaning one way or the other, you're saying, be absolutely sure you're not hitting a pedestrian or a human being. Nevertheless, you're still able to function. You have a low false positive rate. So you have a very low false negative rate and still acceptably low false positive rate. You don't get trigger happy and say everything looks like a pedestrian. So that's where you need models which have, and there are things like ROC curve, receiver operator characteristic curve, one of the technologies you learn in the formal course that comes in, that gives you a sense, area under the ROC curve, that gives you a sense of how really good your model is. A model has to be extraordinarily good for it to be used in something so complex as taking over a driving decision from a person. Right? The other thing is no one measure should be trusted too much. I'll illustrate this with an example. People say that accuracy, very often you say when people talk about classifiers, they talk about accuracy of a model. My model is 99% accurate. It has only 1% error rate. That doesn't mean anything. And I'll illustrate this with a story. See, and this is the history of the medical field. Human body is extraordinarily self-healing. Actually, most mammals, they gradually and spontaneously recover from most illnesses. So look at the world. Today, when we look under the light of modern science, we realize that really modern medicine started with the discovery of antibiotics and modern drugs, which are a very recent vintage. Actually, it started after the First World War. As recent as that, barely 100 years have gone by since modern medicine started to appear. And yet doctors have been there for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So if you ask, when you look back at the medicines they were prescribing, some of the things were useful. There are certain operations, certain procedures they were getting right. But for certain things, the medicines that they were prescribing were absolutely useless. This is particularly true for veterinary science. Most of the medicines before the 20th century were animals. Today we look back at it and we smile because we know that they were absolutely useless medicines. And yet veterinarians were prescribing those medicines confidently. And physicians were prescribing medicines for all sorts of conditions confidently. Why is that? If you think about it, imagine that I'm essentially a quack, but I don't know it. Right? I have been taught some hocus pocus medicine, right? Some form of traditional medicine, which seems to be the fashion of the day. And I set up my practice. A patient comes in, looks pretty sick, and I give something which I might believe personally that it works. Today, but under the glare of modern science, we know it's nonsense. But in those times, a couple of 100 years ago, I give it to the patient. And the patient recovers. Right? And because most people recover from their illness spontaneously over time, the body is self-healing. Let's dissect the situation. What happened? What really happened? If you think about it, many things have happened that we have been talking about in the last 2 days. First of all, why did I believe that this medicine is there? Well, because my professor in medical school taught me, my textbooks taught me, and I see that a patient came, I gave that medicine, and after a few days he recovered. So it induces a confirmation bias. I feel pretty good about it that, okay, my medical science is genuine, isn't it? At the same time, am I a good doctor? I seem to be a good doctor. Most people seem to be cured after seeing me. So, what is the fallacy in this argument? First of all, you realize the accuracy is very high. My medicine works. 99% of the people I cure. So, all I have to give them is a pat on the back and say, my dear fellow, I will take perfectly good care of you. And here's the medicine. Go home and you shall be fine in a week. And you go home and you're fine in a week or 2 or 3, right? And then you start having an extraordinary amount of reverence for me because I seem to be such a great physician. And then you perhaps talk to your friends and explain what a great physician I am, right? And so are reputations made. The other fallacy was the sequentiality is not causation bias. We talked about it yesterday. Because the person was sick and I gave some medicine and the person was cured, does not mean that my medicine cured the person. Isn't it? The only way to know that is in a controlled study. You have to take 2 groups of people. To one group of people, you give the medicine, to other group you don't. And you do it in a double-blind way. Neither physician or patient knows who gets what. Observe what happens. If there is still clear evidence that posterior to being fed the medicine, more patients are likely to be cured than without it, then you have evidence that the medicine may be curing the people. Right? But you cannot do that. And that is the subtlety that gets involved in scientific reasoning. There's a wide gap between what people jump to conclusions for and what is a well-reasoned scientific argument. So it doesn't rise to the level of argument. Nevertheless, the classifier metric, namely accuracy, in such situations is very high. I have a completely bogus model or a bogus medicine. I keep giving it to people. They keep getting cured, but the one person dies. The person who's really sick dies. Am I a good physician? I'm not a good physician because I did not catch that one case, which mattered. And because I didn't catch it, the person died. Isn't it? So I can be a quack sitting there. Everybody comes and says, well, do I have prostate cancer or breast cancer? Based on the gender. And I have only one answer. I'm the Wizard of Oz. I say, no, you're totally fine. That answer would be highly accurate because most people don't have the disease. But in the fatal situations, my predictions would have tragic consequences. Isn't it? So if you consider me a machine learning model, right? Machine learning models are like the Wizard of Oz. You need to go behind the curtain and check whether the wizard is a genuine wizard or not. And the way you do that is by looking at all the metrics, not just accuracy. Because when data has asymmetry, when most people are likely to not have a disease, and only a tiny proportion are likely to have it, then accuracy is not the right measure. You need to look at other measures, in this case, recall and precision and so forth, right? So, which is what the medical literature uses, the good measures, but it is worth mentioning that those considerations do come in. Any other questions? Well, today has been a quiet day. Remember, tomorrow we are not going to have our intro to machine learning session. we're going to have a session on MLOps as part of the meetup, but we'll continue on Thursday with the topic of clustering. And today, with this, I'll end our introduction to classifiers or classification. Once again, any questions? Since there are no questions, I will end today's session. Oh, I noticed there are lots of chat questions. Let me read through the chat. What is the difference between segmentation and classification? Segmentation is a form of classification. It's identifying in an image the different things. It involves both recognizing it and where it is. So segmentation is a little more than classification. Not only you have to tell that this is a tree, but where in the picture is that tree? Okay, he is coming to F1. So F1 actually, F1 is simply the harmonic mean between accuracy and not accuracy, precision and recall. Yeah. And yes, the exposure refers to the totality of, yeah. Good, I like the fact that you, Hershey, you have been thinking through all of this, nice. But if a self-driving vehicle considers more variables at a given time than any human, wouldn't it ultimately be more reliable? That is a very good question, Hershey. See, today, the reality is that a machine learning model can do gradient descent, can discover optimal maneuvers on the road much faster than human reflexes. The cars actually drive better than humans, much better. If you put any of these cars that claim to be self-driven, in US, Tesla is the example, a full self-drive, it does drive very well and better than you and I would drive. It makes decisions much better than us. The problem with it only is that it does not handle corner cases well. For example, in the earlier version, somebody pointed out that if you're following a car and the car ahead of you notices that something big has fallen on the road, and at the last minute makes a maneuver and changes the lane, your self-driving car would not be able to maneuver because it did not anticipate, its probability function didn't anticipate the presence of an unexpected object in the middle of the car, in the middle of the road, at a high speed. And so it will just go and hit it head on. Those accidents actually did happen. And the problem with self-driven cars is, while they drive much better than us, there are some corner situations where humans tend to react better than these cars do. But in the vast majority of cases, they actually drive better than us.
Asif, I'll take, I know talking about self-driving, in one case, I'll take the opposite position. As you said, they have become so much better. I was driving a Tesla and enabled that, whatever that 1 month free FSD that came last month. And I didn't tell my wife, of course, she would have freaked out. So coming from a particular place, I was just impressed as to how it was driving, stopping at every stop sign, dead stop. And it also took an amazing left turn. It kept on waiting because it was green for everybody and it was a flashing yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And it still kept right there because in the opposite lane there was car waiting to take a left turn, but behind it there were car coming and then they would come straight and go next to us. So it kept on looking in the front to ascertain there was really nothing that was moving. Temporarily it was occluded and then it would show up, the other car would show up. it did a really good job. It stayed there for a long time, and then ultimately, when it was safe, it did the left turn. So it has improved quite a bit.
It has improved quite a bit. Yes, true.
Yes, it's dynamically classifying these kinds of cases too.
Yes. And as you know, recently there was one more self-driving accident people are investigating. So see, it just boils down to rare corner cases now that they have to get right. But those corner cases are plentiful, and they have to be handled. Now, the next question I see here is, who could be more trustworthy, an AI doctor capable of simultaneously handling thousands of variables when making a diagnosis, or a physician deeply stressed by pressure from his clientele and colleagues and boards? See, it is amply clear today that AI makes, in many areas, as good a diagnosis or better diagnosis than the best of the physicians. And obviously, when you and I, normal Joes, go to the physician down the street, we are not meeting the best of the physicians. We are meeting the physician on whom the hospital and the insurance has put a time limit of 15 minutes. We are just 15 minutes of their slot for them. So AI is already doing a much better job. The only thing is, there are aspects, human beings see things that the AI doesn't, because AI is fed data. So, for example, the patient may not have mentioned that there is a big wart on his neck, and that wart may be significant because it may be indicative of, let us say, skin cancer, right? Or it may be there's a blotch on the tummy that may be indicative, for example, of renal failure or something like that, or hepatic failure. Things that the patient is not telling you will not show up in the data. The reason you should have a physician and an observant physician is to, amongst other things, create the data, observe the real human being, and create the data, provoke, observe, use the stethoscope and the instruments to carefully write down the observations. Then the differential diagnosis part, yes, AI is already getting very, very good. And so it's not a either or, but it's a situation where I would argue that hereafter, every physician should be AI assisted in the differential diagnosis phase. Roger, does that answer your question? I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Indeed.
And last, but in medicine, many events are sequential, starting from the very principle of genetics. That is true. Obviously, we have childhood before adulthood, and adulthood is a consequence of childhood after that. There is certain sequentiality. So it isn't that because it's sequential, it cannot be causal is not true. The converse is not true. Things can still be causal. Many things happen causally that are sequential, but sequentiality does not prove causality. That's the more accurate statement. And yes, it is completely true that in the differential diagnosis and the interpretation aspect, AI is getting extraordinarily smart. Actually, what people are observing is that AI will come up with 3-4 diagnoses for a given set of observations. Most physicians, they fall into a groove and they will have only one diagnosis. And what hospitals and research groups are finding is, by making the physicians aware of alternate differential diagnosis, it really opens up the possibility of better healthcare. Like, it induces the physician to perhaps recommend tests that may relate to the other diagnosis, other possible diagnosis.
I also seen that doctors, based on if you give an additional extra input, I think sometimes it's hard because you already bias the doctor in a particular way. I don't know whether you can bias the machine actually, because if it has a plan, like a combination of AI data plus expert system, then it would try to go back to the original diagnosis. But when you start a conversation with the doctor, you can bias unless the doctor can reset its process for diagnosis.
See, yes and no. See, I'm not a physician, by the way, by any means or training. but since I have looked at data, you're supposed to follow, there's something called the SOAP, subjective, objective, assessment, and plan of action. So subjective is what the patient is telling you. That should only be a trigger point for a much more objective examination of and noting down the observations, right? And out of those observations should come an assessment and a plan of action. That's the sort of the procedure, the heuristics that physicians are supposed to follow. So it is possible that you can confuse a physician, but well-trained, I mean, that's the reason they go through years of training. Well-trained physicians usually know what to discount and what to listen to.
That makes sense.
Any more questions, guys? All right, folks. So I hope I have answered all the questions on the. There was a mention of outliers. Oh, yes, yes. So there are certain algorithms which are sensitive to outliers, and there are algorithms which are pretty immune to outliers. Support vector machines, after which our company, our AI, this group is named. It belongs to a class of algorithms that are very, very immune and robust to presence of outliers in data. On the other hand, the simple regression models are very sensitive to outliers, or classification models are very sensitive to outliers. So if you're using simpler models, you need to watch out for outliers and do outlier treatment. Any other questions, guys? All right, then. I wish you all a very good evening. And I look forward to seeing you again on Thursday evening. And tomorrow evening, if you're coming to the MLOps talk, which is going to be very interesting. LLM Ops and MLOps talk that Christian will be doing. Okay then, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Asif.
Thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Asif,
Asif.
what is the next one in this series?
Clustering,
Clustering. Okay, great. And the one after that?
dimensionality reduction.
Oh, dimensional. PCA too?
Yeah, PC is part of dimensionality reduction.
Okay, perfect. Very excited. Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you, Asif.
Thank you. Nice to see you here.
Thank you.
Bye.